Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another ON1 live webinar. Today we're going to be talking about portrait editing and retouching. So we'll start out, we'll dive into a few raw images, and from start to finish, we'll edit, we'll retouch, and we'll talk about a lot of the steps along the way. So inside Photo RAW here, let's grab this portrait, and I'm just going to hit D on my keyboard, and that's going to take me into the edit module. So let's go over and I'll change my view to levels so we can see the histogram. And whenever we're editing portraits, there's a few different ways you could start out. You could start out by developing the basic tone. You could start out by retouching. You could start out by cropping. There's many different ways that you could do it. But for this particular photo, I think we should go in and we'll pull out that base look. We'll set sort of our foundational tonalities for this image. And then we can actually see where we need to retouch a little bit better. So we'll start in the Develop tab here, and we'll head down to Tone and Color. And let's take a look at this image first. So if we take a look at the areas around our model here, they're pretty blown out. And if we want to pull up on the exposure to bring some of the light back into on our face, we're going to pull up on the exposure around these areas also, and we're going to blow them out even more. But for this photo, don't even worry about these areas at all. Don't worry about the blown out areas, because later we can go in and we can modify those and fix those with a new local adjustment layer. So first, let's just go in. I'm going to zoom in 50. We'll pull this up. Okay, so inside Tone and Color, again, just focusing on the face area. We're not too worried about these areas over here. We're going to pull up on the exposure, and that's going to bring in a little bit more light to our face, maybe about half a stop. Looks pretty good. And whenever we're pulling up on the exposure or our midtones or our shadows, we're going to be losing some contrast. So typically if I'm pulling up on my exposure or my midtones quite a bit, I'll go back and I'll add in some contrast to kind of compensate. So we have quite of a exposure boost right now, and then we've added in some contrast, but the skin tones on her face need a little bit of love, so I think they could use a mid-tone boost, and the mid-tones on this photo would be mainly these skin tones and then whatever sort of middle grays they have. So watch as we pull up on these mid-tones, and it's bringing in a lot of that skin tonality back. And we don't want it too much. We don't want to blow out any areas on her skin, just enough so that we can see her face a little bit better. And then shadows I think are good. Whites I'm probably not going to modify. And then blacks, we could actually use the black slider to add in contrast on top of our contrast slider. So if I hold down my J key, it's going to show me my clipping warning. So this red overlay right here, that's my true white without any detail. So that'd be probably considered a blown out area. And now watch as I pull up on my blacks down here, you'll see there's a blue overlay that starts to creep in on the photo. That's my true black without any detail. So those would be considered underexposed areas. So we can use this black slider and add in just enough. I think -10 looks pretty good actually. We can add in just enough contrast so that we have a nice photo with detail and it doesn't look flat. And then we have color down here. So, oh, actually we're missing two. So below blacks in our tone and color pane, we have structure and haze. Now I tend to avoid these two whenever I'm photographing and editing portraits, because I don't like to add structure or detail onto skin unless it needs it. And if I do want to do that, I could usually do that with a dynamic contrast filter or a local adjustment. So I'm actually going to avoid these two for this photo, and we'll just skip right down to color. So I'm going to click on this Kelvin so I can actually see what it was shot at. So it was shot at 4358. And let's zoom out so we can get a better look at this shot. And I think if we cool it down, actually I like it a little warmer. Maybe just a little bit, you know, like maybe 100 degrees Kelvin more. I think that looks pretty good. Sweet. So now we have kind of our foundational look set for this image. So what we could do now is we could actually go in and we could retouch. We can see a lot more of these blemishes now. So let's go in and let's retouch using our retouch tools. So I'm actually going to click 50 again. Actually, let's go into 100. And I'm going to grab my retouch tools over here. I could also grab my retouch brush by hitting R on my keyboard. And the retouch brush works like a paintbrush, so you can go up and modify your brush size, which you can also do with the bracket keys on your keyboard. You can modify the feathering, so if you want a really soft brush edge or a hard brush edge, you can use this to modify that. And then we have opacity. I typically have my feathering at 100 and my opacity at 100. The reason being I want sort of a soft edge around my retouching, and also I usually want it to remove all of the blemish. So what I like to do whenever I'm painting this on is I'll make my brush size just a little bit bigger than the blemish I'm trying to remove. And then I'll just brush this on where the blemish is at. And sometimes it takes a couple tries, but you can usually get it. There we go. And then we'll just keep brushing these out. Perfect. We'll move down to this one, make our brush size a little bit smaller. And I'm brushing kind of with the shadow so that it leaves a natural looking retouch, just like that. Make these a little bit bigger for these ones out of focus. Perfect. And then we'll remove this one and this one. Then we'll make our brush size quite a bit smaller for this little guy, and then we'll brush this on. And then I see a little bit of dark makeup in here, which you probably couldn't be able to see it from out there, but we'll just remove it anyway. And then we'll remove this one. We'll zoom up here, and she doesn't have too many on her forehead, but there's still a little bit there, so we'll just remove a few of these just to make sure. And it's all personal preference on how much or how little retouching you want to do onto your photo. You could do a ton, you could do very little. It also kind of depends on the skin as well. So just zoom out real quick, and there we go. I think that looks pretty good as far as the retouching goes. One thing we could do is we could actually go in and apply the retouching selectively in effects. And the reason we could do that is because we have this leaf right here kind of covering her face, and then we have this area covering her face. So if we went to the portrait tab, it might have a tough time going in and detecting that face and creating a mask around it for us. So let's just go in and we'll apply some skin smoothing with a filter. So I'll add a filter and we'll add skin retouching. So skin retouching is a great tool for smoothing out skin and removing blemishes. So let's zoom into 50 here again. I'll move this up. And so whenever we apply skin retouching inside of our effects tab, it's going to automatically be applied to the entire photo. So if we turn this off and on, not really doing much, but it's being applied to the entire shot. So whenever I'm adding in skin retouching as a filter, I'll use this color dropper. I'll drop it on kind of a neutral skin tone. And now if I pull up on the smoothing, and we turn this off and on, it's a little intense, so we'll pull back on that maybe a tad, probably about right there. And then I think we could use this shine also to remove a little bit of the shine. So now if we turn this off and on, it does a good job of smoothing out the skin, but we need to remove it from these areas that aren't her skin. So we'll go into our skin retouching filter, use my masking options, and I'll invert this mask. So the mask is inverted, and so now we need to selectively apply this. So I already have my masking brush selected. So I'm gonna go up and make sure that my opacity is at 100. Oops. So then I'm brushing this in completely, and I'm gonna switch my mode to paint in. So I'm gonna hold down Shift and hit X. So now I'm painting in this filter. So now we'll just brush this on. So now if we turn this off and on, does a good job of smoothing out her skin. So the next thing we could do to kind of deal with her features here is we could go in and just add in a little bit more whitening and detail to her eyes. So I like to use my local adjustment tab for that. So I'll go into my local adjustments. We'll add a new local adjustment layer, and we're going to use a preset, and we're going to use Magic Eye Fixer. So with Magic Eye Fixer selected, it's going to add in a little bit of exposure, some structure, and it's going to remove haze. So if I brush this on, you can see it's really intense at first, really super intense. But we can always go back and we can modify the opacity to make it more natural. So let's go over and we'll modify the opacity, put it about maybe 30. 29 looks pretty good. Sweet. So let's zoom out. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, I think we've done a pretty good job of retouching and setting the foundational look. So now let's go in and let's fix this blown out area around the model. So we're going to add a new local adjustment layer. In this new local adjustment layer, I'm going to make sure it's set to darken, and I'm going to pull back on this probably about 2.5 stops. So with this local adjustment layer set to darken, I'm going to hold down Shift and I'm going to hit K on my keyboard. That's going to grab me my adjustable gradient. So in this adjustable gradient, I'm going to use my shapes and I'm going to change it to center. And with the center shape chosen and my local adjustment layer set to darken, that's going to create sort of a vignette. So it's going to make sure everything inside of the shape doesn't get the filter applied, whereas everything outside gets this adjustment applied. So if I drop this down, you can see it applies around the mask and it's not applied inside. So what I like to do with this, if I have a blown out area around a face, is I'll turn this around to kind of match the shape of her eye. And now I'll just pull this down quite a bit. I mean, really quite a bit, really small. Smaller the better. See if we can get a little smaller. Like that. Put it right on her eye. And you can see it's doing a good job of really toning down those blown out areas. And now if I feather this, we'll feather it quite a bit. See how we've really toned down those areas in here, but we've brought back that light into her face. So if I turn this adjustment off and on, it brings the viewer's attention right into these eyes and it tones down this area to the left. Really just kind of acting as a shade for this blown out area. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we can see our original. And I think we've kind of set our foundational look. We've modified this photo to remove these blown out areas, and we've also retouched. So let's go in and let's just stylize this photo real quick. We'll go into effects. Let's add a filter. And let's just stylize with a LUTs. And I actually really like that, how that looks. Let's just turn this off and on. Oh, I like that. So let's leave that and let's add one more filter. And let's bring in sort of a cinematic look to this shot. So I'm going to add a curves filter. And what I like to do, if I have kind of a blue tint on a portrait, is I'll go into my curves. And with this left point down here, this left bottom point, that's our blacks. So I'm going to grab my black point. If I pull up on it and I pull into the right, see how it adds in kind of a cinematic faded look onto the shot? So I could just keep adding that in until I get the look I want. And then pull up on the shadows a little maybe. And then let's bring in kind of a mid-tone boost. Maybe like that. So now if I turn this off and on, maybe a little bit less of a mid-tone. And one thing you could do when you're modifying portraits is if you're playing with something, let's say you're playing with a curves filter, and you're playing with it, and you're like, oh, I don't really like how that's dealing with the color. Let's say you don't want this filter to modify the color, you just want it to modify kind of the tonality, or these areas that you're modifying, like your black point, your shadows, and your midtones. Well, if you only want this to be applied to the color or the luminosity in your image, you can just go up to your gear icon here. We'll go to our blending mode, and let's go down to luminosity. So now that we've chosen luminosity, if I turn this curves filter off and on, see how it's not modifying the color at all? It's only modifying the luminance or the tones in this photo. Whereas if I only wanted to apply to the color, I could go into mode and I could go down to color. And so now it's not modifying the tones, it's just modifying the color. But let's go back into our mode and we'll just choose luminosity. And then I'll pull up a little bit more. Just like that. Perfect. So now let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard. And I think we've done an awesome job of really setting a sort of cinematic, stylistic look with this portrait. So let's move on. And similar to the last photo, I think we should play with the light a bit. So let's just focus on this light on her face right here. And let's go in and let's modify kind of the areas surrounding it and create this sort of moody, mysterious look. So first, rather than pulling out our tonality for this image, I think let's go in, and since there's not a whole lot of retouching we can do, and since we're not very close up on her face, we could probably do the retouching right now. So I'm just going to hit R on my keyboard. It's going to grab me my retouch brush. So now I'm just going to use this. I'm going to brush this on. There we go. And it'll smooth out her skin a little bit. Can smooth out this area. Like that. There we go. Keep kind of applying it. And again, it's all personal preference, you know, how much or how little you want to remove. There we go. Then we'll do this little scar right there. And maybe this. Perfect. Okay, so let's zoom out. And now that we've retouched this portrait, I'm going to go in and let's crop it real quick. So I'm just going to crop this top part off, just to remove some of this excess area so we can really get a little closer with our model here. So I'm going to hit C on my keyboard. It's going to grab my crop tool. And I'm going to make sure I have a 4x5 selected. And I'm just going to pull this down a little bit and kind of align this rule of thirds line on her eyes. But I don't want too much of this top, so I might make this a little bit smaller. And then bring it over again. Perfect. I think that looks pretty good. We'll leave that bottom of her jacket in, and then I'll just hit enter. And there we go. We have nice, kind of a nicely cropped photo that we can deal with now. So inside of my tone and color here, I'm probably not going to modify my camera profile at all. I think ON1 standard looks pretty good. But if you are shooting in RAW, definitely go through these and see what they look like. ON1 portrait, if you have an underexposed portrait, the ON1 portrait does an awesome job of just bringing life back in your image. So just play with those if you're shooting in RAW. They're a really fun way to modify your base look. So with this portrait, I'm not going to modify my exposure at all. I think the exposure is probably where I want it. What I could do here is I could actually pull back or pull up on the contrast. And the reason I want to add in a little bit of contrast is because for that mysterious kind of moody look, we're going to darken this area around our subject, and we'll just focus on this light on her face. So we're going to add in contrast to kind of darken those areas around her, and we're not really too worried about the contrast on her face because we're going to fix that later with a local adjustment layer. So inside of our tone and color, I'm going to pull up on my contrast just a little bit, and then I want to bring in a little bit more life to kind of these mid-tone areas on her face. So a lot of skin tones in photography are mid-tones, so we'll just pull up on our mid-tones here, and that'll bring back some of those mid-tone areas within. And then again, we can go back down to our black point if we want to add in more contrast. So I'll hold down my J key, and then I'll pull back on the blacks. There we go, to add in a little bit more true black. Right there, looks pretty good. And then we could also pull back on the shadow tones a little bit. And the shadow tones would be the darker tones in your photo, the shadows. So if you want a little darker shadows, go over here and you could pull back on these shadow tones, and we've darkened that area around her a little bit more. And below that, I'm probably not going to modify structure or haze again since we are dealing with skin. So we'll just head on down to color, and we'll hit Kelvin. And let's just see what this would look like with other settings applied. So daylight, it was probably shot in daylight, but this is a little bit too warm. So let's go back to add shot. And I think that looks pretty good as far as color goes. We could honestly probably turn this into a black and white later, which I'm thinking that's probably what we're going to do. But we'll just leave this look how it is, and then I'll show you how you can modify the color really quickly with a split tone filter if you want to kind of bring more of a cinematic color grading look into your shot. So we'll leave the color, and then let's go and let's start making sort of this darkness around our model. So we'll go into our local adjustments tab here, and with this new local adjustment layer, I'm going to make sure it's set to darken, and I'm going to hold down Shift, hit K on my keyboard. That's going to grab me my adjustable gradient, and with this adjustable gradient, I'm going to go up to my preset. I'm going to make sure that my preset is set to linear top. So in these presets, if you look over here, it'll show you the mask of what that preset is doing. So you can see the bottom part is white, and this top part is black. So it's going to conceal this from the top part, and it's going to apply it to the bottom. So we'll click linear top, we'll drop this down, and then I'm just going to kind of move this around like that. And again, we're not too worried about the light on her face right now, because we can go back and we'll fix it with the local adjustment layer. So I'm just going to feather this quite a bit, maybe like that. And then I'm actually going to pull back on this, maybe like 2.5, 3 stops. Just like that, maybe a little bit more. Cool, just like that. So if we turn this off and on, does a good job of darkening that area up. So let's add in a little bit more contrast to this adjustment so we can darken this just even more. And so if I turn this off and on, obviously it's covering her, and we're kind of just covering her with darkness. Well, one thing that we can do to kind of bring her back into play is we can go into this gear icon here, and notice how we have a lot of these highlights on her jacket. Well, if we want to protect those and kind of bring them back into the shot, we can go into our blending options, and we can pull up on this highlight slider, and this will protect some of those highlights to bring them back into the photograph. So now it looks like the shadow's behind her and not so much just on top of her. So now let's bring back the light on her face here. We'll go in, we'll add a new adjustment layer. Make sure it's set to lighten. And I'm gonna make sure I have my adjustable gradient selected. I'm gonna go to shape. And rather than choosing center, we're gonna choose edges. And we want edges so that the lighten local adjustment layer is applied inside the middle of the mask. And rather than center, where it's applied outside, we can brighten the area inside of it. So I'll just drop this down real quick. I'll make it incredibly small again. So it's typically like kind of my jam is I'll make these local adjustment gradients really small on their faces, and then I'll just put it kind of where I want it. And even then, if I turn this off and on, I feel like it adds kind of a cool, mysterious kind of spotlight look on her face. And now we can go in and let's feather this. So now if we feather that, now if we turn this off and on, we've brought back that light into her face. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, we're really on the right track of just kind of honing in on this light on her face and dimming down these areas around her. So I think that looks good as far as just the base look goes for the Develop tab and our Local Adjustments tab. Let's go into Effects, and let's add a filter, and I'm going to add a Sunshine filter. And the reason I want to add Sunshine is you can see it does an awesome job of darkening these areas around our subject, but then brings in a lot more light into the brighter areas. So the Sunshine filter acts as sunshine. It brightens the bright areas in your image, and it tones down the dark to create heavier shadows. Well, let's actually go in, and I'm going to pull back on this warmth a little bit just so it's not so warm. Because if I heat this up, it almost melts the colors in her face. So let's just cool it down a little bit, right about there. But I think that looks pretty good as far as this filter goes. So now let's go in and let's add another filter, and let's add in a filter that deals with the color in this photograph. So let's go in, I'm going to add a split tone filter here. And split toning is awesome for bringing in sort of a cinematic stylistic look, because you can modify the color of the highlights and the shadows. Well, one of my favorite presets in here is this cool preset. And with these presets, you can actually go down and change the mode. So there's these different blending modes that you can use to blend on this split tone filter. The normal mode is going to give you kind of a hazy look onto your shot. Color is only, again, applied to the color in the photo. So if I click this, you're not modifying anything other than the color. This is one of my favorite modes. And then we have lighten, which lighten is always going to lighten your photograph. We have darken, which it's going to, again, darken. Multiply is going to darken even more. And then screen is going to lighten even more. And then classic, like it was in Lightroom. So let's leave color. I like color. So if I turn this off and on, does an awesome job of bringing back that cool kind of color. It looks like a cop drama kind of postcard shot right here. So let's add another filter, and let's get stylistic with some textures. So I'll go in here, I'll add a texture, and let's go in and we'll go into photographic, and let's add a bokeh texture in the background. So let's use this one, and let's actually flip it around. We'll flip around like that looks pretty good. So now I'll go in, and I'm actually going to go up to my opacity, and I'm going to change this to lighter. So I know it's really intense right now. I know this is pretty intense. But what we're going to do is we're going to blend this in using a mask. So I'm going to go into my masking options for this texture. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to click Lumen. That's going to create a luminosity mask for me. And now if I view this, it's telling me to apply this to the brighter areas, but I want this bokeh applied to the darker areas. So I'll go into my luminosity mask and I'll invert this So now it's applied to the areas around her, these kind of dark areas. Well, that's all fine. That looks great. One thing I could do here is I'm going to pull up my masking brush, and I'm just going to brush this out from her face so that none of the bokeh is applied anywhere on her face. So now if we view this, it does a lot better job, and it's not applied to her face. So obviously it's pretty strong. So we can always go back again to our opacity, and we'll just bring it up a little bit, like that. And so now it's a very subtle, yet very powerful creative overlay in the background of this photo. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, in not a lot of time, we've kind of made a drama-esque, moody photo just from that one image using local adjustments, filters, and some develop settings. So now let's go in, I'll add another filter, and let's just see what this looks like with the black and white. I think it would look really cool. So I'll go in, I'll add a LUTs filter. And then these LUTs filter, they have really awesome black and white. So in this black and white category, let's just see what these look like here. A little too much. I think I like that halide. I think that looks pretty cool, just like that. Sweet. So let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard. We can see our original. And yeah, I think it does a really good job of playing on that light on her face here. And we've really toned down those areas around our model and just focused in on the light surrounding her. And one thing we could do to kind of really dramatize this is we could add a filter. We'll add a vignette. We could add Big Softy. And then we could use this centering tool to just center it on her face. So now it's even more noir-esque and does a really good job of just focusing our viewers' attention on this area. All right, well, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Hope you guys learned some tips and tricks on editing and retouching portraits. Stay tuned for more ON1 Live webinars, and have a great rest of your week.